Mr. President, as Republicans in both chambers rush to conclude their secret negotiations on the final details of their tax bill, I want to make clear to my colleagues what should be obvious about this legislation. We may not yet know the results of all their horse trading leading up to the final legislation, but the American people are watching this process. And it's plain to see that should this Republican bill become law, Republicans will have knowingly and deliberately made worse the most dangerous threats that we face to our economy and our national security. And worse yet, they will have drained the public coffers that our children and our children's children will need to take up these challenges. We all know what these challenges are. We face unprecedented income and wealth inequality that threatens to stifle the social mobility that is the hallmark of the American dream. There is also declining productivity, which has kept middle-class wages stagnant and bred economic anxiety for too many parents wondering if their children will attain a higher standard of living, much higher, they hope, than they have done so. And we have a surging deficit from decades of trickle-down economics and unpaid-for wars that, if left unaddressed, could apply huge budget pressure to our ability to keep our most basic promises to the American people, not to mention meeting our obligations as a world power. To families watching what is going on in Washington right now, the Republican endgame appears to be to invite fiscal crisis with irresponsible tax cuts for the wealthy and big corporations, and then, because we have already given trillions of dollars away in tax cuts, to demand that Congress shred Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other vital programs in order to pay our bills. We know this is the road that this bill sets us up upon, and the American people certainly see this coming. So let no one who votes for this bill say that they did not know the consequences of their actions. This will not be remembered as tax reform, but rather as a serious mistake to be corrected in the future. How do middle-class Americans know that Republicans did not write this bill for them? Because they have watched Republican economics rig the tax system in favor of the wealthy and corporations for years, even as income and wealth inequality have reached historical levels. They took the Republicans at their word when Republicans promised that the Bush tax cuts of 2001 and 2003, which skewed tax relief for the top 1% over the bottom 20% of Americans by more than 6 to 1, would eventually trickle down. That's what they thought. But even on the eve of the Great Recession, after tax income for the richest 1% had soared while middle-class wages continued to stagnate, we are still waiting for the Bush tax cuts to trickle down and to pay for themselves, and they likely never will. These Republican proposals make matters even worse by financing tax giveaways for big business and the rich on the backs of people just trying to get by. Economists relying on the Federal Survey of Consumer Finances recently determined that the top 1% of American households now hold about 40% of the nation's wealth, which is a 50-year high. This legislation overwhelmingly benefits them while raising taxes on 48% of American taxpayers by 2027. Many of the families whose taxes will go up have already been through tough economic times during the Great Recession. Productivity in the American workforce has been declining, and wages have grown at an even slower pace than that. These families don't need numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to know that our nation's recovery was historically slow, but our middle class weathered the Great Recession, as Americans have always done. Now, because of the lopsidedness and deficit-busting features of the Republican tax bill, Moody's Analytics has warned that, in their words, this legislation is a fiscal policy mistake, and it could very well take us prematurely into an economic bust. Middle-class families have just emerged from the last crisis of Republican economics, still battered and bruised, and they know if Republicans force a plan like this on the nation again, it will be their children who are on the hook to pay for it. Make no mistake, there are times when running a deficit is advisable or even economically necessary, particularly when times are tough and families need help to stay in the working class and get back on their feet. But regressive tax cuts just sit on our credit card with little to show for all that red ink, and the tab we are leaving to the next generation is still running from 16 years ago. Like many of my colleagues, I was here to take the tough votes and make the hard choices that led to the Clinton-era surplus. The failed experiment of supply-side economics turned that surplus into a CBO projected deficit of over $10 trillion over the next decade. And even if we accept all the rosy assumptions of dynamic scoring and take it on faith yet again that wealth will trickle down and that no recession will come in the next decade, all of which are assumptions on which I would wager anything, the Joint Committee on Taxation calculates that this bill will still increase the deficit by over $1 trillion. Facts do not go away simply because we ignore them. And if Republicans continue to ignore the budget hole that their policies create, then the fact of this massive deficit and the budget pressure that follow it will be their legacy for future generations. More importantly, however, I must ask, what our national priorities will our colleagues on the other side deem too expensive after we have given $1 trillion more borrowed dollars to the wealthy? What choices will Republicans try to force on the American people when they decide that there simply isn't enough for the armed forces, the jobless, the sick, and the elderly? Republican leadership is already vowing to take up entitlement reform next year, which is Washington speak for giving the top 1% everything they want and then forcing practically everyone else to choose who loses their Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid to plug the budget hole. Therefore, before Republicans blow apart the federal budget yet again, it is worth reviewing the massive cost that the American people are already committed to pay. First, as I've discussed before, this bill essentially guarantees that we will struggle to meet the needs of our national defense. Our war deficits from the past 16 years alone are projected to add over $1 trillion to the national debt by 2023 and over $8 trillion by 2056. And we all know we must modernize the nuclear triad, which will cost $1.2 trillion in 2017 dollars over the next 30 years. A 355-ship Navy would cost, on average, $102 billion per year through 2047. Necessary additions to the end strength of the Army, Air Force, and Marine Corps will cost an additional $18 billion, $6 billion, and $3.6 billion, respectively. And where will this money come from, since we've already given it away to the wealthiest Americans? This chart shows what happens to the defense budget when large-scale tax reductions are put in effect. Starting in the Reagan era, in the 1980s, President Reagan, one of his first initiatives was to build up defense. This chart shows the percentage of GDP devoted to defense spending. And President Reagan came up to make America strong, to actualize his feeling and his view of peace through strength. He built up the Defense Department budget significantly, going from a little over 5% when he took office up to almost 7%. But in the mid-'80s, he also engineered tax cuts that lowered taxes on the wealthy in proportion to lower-income Americans. And eventually, those tax cuts and the deficit caught up with defense spending. And as you notice, through the later 80s and all the way into the 90s, we had, except for one respite, a declining defense budget. In the first year of the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, there was again another attempt to increase defense spending, so the line went up a bit. But after that, of course, with deficits increasing, with other pressures mounting on the budget, defense spending plummeted. Then, within the Clinton administration, there was a conscious effort to reduce defense spending, so-called Cold War peace dividend. That took place. At the same time, though, we were, because of the tough votes on tax reform that we took, building up a significant surplus. And you saw again here, with the beginning of the George W. Bush administration, an increase in defense spending. Once again, that was a product of, one, the desire of the president to lower taxes, which he did, but two, and more importantly, was the unexpected and catastrophic attack on the United States in November 11th, 2001. So that, together with later decisions to go into Iraq, to maintain our presence in Afghanistan, led us to increase defense spending. But once again, a growing deficit with tax cuts, with no increases to pay for wartime operations, saw the defense budget peak and then begin to decline. And we're in that decline right now. And I think if history is any judge, when we pass these tax cuts, we will see further decline as defense spending is squeezed by an already acknowledged increased deficit and by the difficulty to cut other programs. So we are not positioning ourselves well. And as I previously mentioned, we are already looking ahead at necessary expenditures totaling trillions of dollars of the future that if we don't make, will leave our armed forces in a very, very precarious position. And our position in the world is a very precarious position. But the irony will be that we will have many of my colleagues come down here and vote one day on a huge tax reduction for the wealthiest and including a $1.5 trillion deficit increase, and the next day say, we need more money for our military. That's the most important thing. Well, if our military was the most important thing, we'd be voting on a bill to provide that type of financial support and relief to the military today and letting the tax cuts for the wealthy wait. This is one of the remarkable periods in history, probably the first time in our history, that we have conducted a war for 16 years, and we have yet to go and ask the American people in any significant way to participate by contributing to the national defense directly. In fact, throughout this period, with rare exceptions, we've cut the taxes, and the cuts basically benefit the wealthiest Americans. That's why all of this together caused former Secretaries of Defense Leon Panetta and Ash Carter and Chuck Hale to indicate that this approach, this tax bill, is ill-advised. Following 16 years of debt-financed war, providing even bigger deficit-busting tax cuts doesn't make any sense for our national security. My comments previously, the comments of former Secretaries of Defense and others, seem to have touched a nerve with Speaker Ryan because he, when asked specifically, took some umbrage with these comments. In an interview with NPR, he said he simply could not understand where our concerns were coming from. To put it bluntly, I am comfortable siding with three former Secretaries of Defense over the Speaker when it comes to budgeting for the men and women of our armed forces. And this is for the reasons I outlined in my discussion of the history of defense spending and tax cuts over the last 30-plus years. Inevitably, the tax cuts to the wealthy, primarily because we have a progressive system and because the way particularly this bill is structuring corporate tax cuts as well as tax cuts to wealthy individuals, eventually the pressure gets to our defense spending. And what I don't want to happen, again, is have people down here 2 months from now pounding the desk about how we're not responding to the needs of our troops. We haven't made them the most important thing in our lives. We're neglecting our national defense because, frankly, they have ignored this whole topic when they're committed to giving tax cuts and increase the deficit. That is the wrong priority in my view. As the chart clearly demonstrates, these tax cuts eventually catch up with us. They produce defense cuts, maybe not immediately, but we're not working on a situation we had in 2001 when President George W. Bush instituted his tax cuts. We had a $5 trillion surplus on the books. That was because we had took those tough votes in the 90s to increase taxes, to build up a surplus, so he could operate off that surplus, not only in response initially to 9/11, but also in response to other concerns. We don't have that pad any longer. We are already $10 trillion in the hole. So the effect of these cuts will be much quicker, much more dramatic when it comes to the situation we will face in terms of not only supporting our military, but actually taking major steps to upgrade the platforms, the technology, the training, the readiness, and the quality of life of the forces. We don't have a $5 trillion surplus to dip into to sort of pay off the wealthiest while we try to fix defense. So we are in a situation where this advocacy for this tax cut, in my view, totally ignores and deliberately ignores the cost we're going to have to pay to protect ourselves. So, as I said previously, we are now embarking on another tax cut. So, for the first time in our history, we have conducted now almost 20 years of war, and we've asked our troops to serve and their families to serve, but we haven't asked any other American to stand up, at least with their financial support, and help us deal with the crises we face across the globe. But it's not just our armed forces that will be squeezed out and crowded out of the federal budget because of these Republican proposals. The middle class and working poor will also have to do a lot more with a lot less. Many of my colleagues have already pointed out that the CBO has estimated 13 million Americans will lose their health insurance because Republicans will repeal the individual mandate to pay for tax cuts. Now, they can try to spin this as an expansion of choices, but the bottom line is that more people will be sick and fewer of them will get the care they need. Other middle-class American families can expect to lose access to critical tax advantages that allow them to remain self-sufficient during hard times. This approach promises to crush families on two fronts. It will force more families who are down in their luck to slip out of the working class, and then, because of massive deficits, the social safety net will be weakened when these families need it the most. This legislation is likely to trigger already a $25 billion cut to Medicare in 2018 alone. And with the Republicans' entitlement reform on the docket for next year, publicly announced by Speaker Ryan, this may just be the tip of the iceberg. If we pass this tax bill, we are, under our pay-go rules, in a position where we will be facing a $25 billion cut to Medicare just next year, 2018. So this vote really is not, for most Americans, not about taxes, it's about Medicare. What they thought they earned, what they thought and think they're entitled to, what their children believe they need in order to withstand the obvious health problems as one ages. And this does not even begin to cover the other struggles that we're seeing working Americans face every day. We are in the midst of a historic decline in labor force participation that economists are struggling to explain. And many states that are experiencing steep declines in labor force participation are among those hardest hit by the opioid epidemic. Now, recall, a few weeks ago, President Trump declared a national emergency of opioids. Where are the resources coming to face that national emergency? Well, there won't be much left after this tax cut. And what we're beginning to see, again, it's not cause and effect, but it is a correlation, is that a lot of individuals who are leaving the workforce because they feel displaced by new technology or because they're non-competitive for a number of reasons, they seem to correlate very highly in those states with these large losses with this opioid epidemic. And in my own home state of Rhode Island, this epidemic is real. It is taking the lives of individuals. And on a national scale, it is something that has already been proclaimed a public health crisis and emergency by the president. But again, where will the money come from after these tax cuts? Will the problem just go away? I doubt it. Certainly the money's going away, but not the problem. And we have to ask ourselves again, if we are in a national emergency, a national public health emergency, Why aren't we standing up and providing the resources to help Americans facing this crisis? It just goes back to the same logic. If we're in our 16th or 17th year of war, why aren't we standing up and saying, we've got to put some money for the troops and their equipment and their families? No. What we're saying, what my colleague is saying is, we've got to cut taxes for the wealthiest Americans, for corporations. We've got to create pass-through entities that will allow money to filter through to equity, private equity concerns, to legal firms, to accountants, to be able to even avoid more taxes. As we look at these problems, millions of Americans are sitting around their table and they don't believe that we need to give trillion-dollar tax deductions to corporations that have international operations. They're more likely thinking about more mundane things closer to their lives, like what about the roads and bridges in my community? Why does this country have an investment backlog in transportation of $836 billion for highways and bridges and $122 billion for transit? Why aren't we, as the president seemed to indicate in his campaign, why aren't we doing a big infrastructure bill now, which is going to cost real money? Instead, we are giving real money away. And this makes a huge difference because it's not just the infrastructure, it's the jobs. And these are the middle-class jobs. These are not the private equity analysts. These aren't the sophisticated financial engineers. These are the laborers and the structural engineers and the people, the men and women who pour the concrete. If we invest in infrastructure, they get it. This tax bill, they're not going to get much out of it. And at that family dinner table, they're probably wondering, too, about how can they afford to send their children to college? How can they even continue to send their children to elementary and secondary schools that are in a horrendous state of repair? The Department of Education has estimated it would cost $197 billion to bring all public schools in the United States to good condition. And there is a $38 billion funding gap in annual capital construction and new facility funding. This is not a round problem. This is a problem in every state in the union. Public school buildings that are decrepit, dangerous sometimes, and yet we're sending children to those schools. And if this legislation passes, where will we find the money to help state and local communities deal with these issues so that children can go to schools that are modern, up-to-date, places where they can learn? Once you get past the elementary and secondary education level, today everyone insists, indeed the jobs of the future all require more than high school education. We have a generation that's racked up about $1.3 trillion in student loans and are facing job markets that provide little opportunities or not enough opportunities to pay them off. And they're worried. They're worried that their children, many of whom are still living with them after college, will never be able to pay off these loans. So where is the multi-billion-dollar package of assistance, aid, loan forgiveness that allow this generation of Americans to have the same benefits that my generation had, which is basically being able, through Pell Grants and Stafford loans, to attend a good college and leave with little or no debt. That's not the situation today. And everyone in this chamber knows, because when they go home, they hear from parents that were wondering, when will their child ever get out from underneath the significant debt that they have? These are all real problems that working families face. And there's another problem that's looming that exacerbates these problems even more dramatically. According to the McKinsey Global Institute, up to 30% of the work done by 60% of the occupations today is vulnerable to automation. By 2030, 75 million to 375 million, up to 14% of the global workforce, will need to change jobs. We are facing, because of the advances in artificial intelligence and automation and computer technology, a huge erosion in the jobs that we need. So what are families doing? What should we be doing? Frankly, we should be thinking of ways we can help people make the transition, prepare them for what we know is coming. We know there's going to be a huge loss of jobs. We know also, too, that when people drop out of the workforce, when companies get smaller, their pensions obligations don't get that much smaller. And we're also facing huge shortages in terms of pensions. And one of the ironies that I suggest will happen, and irony is too gentle a word, is that these corporations who are getting these huge tax benefits, they're not going to raise wages. They're not going to turn it over to their people who work for them. They will buy back their stock. And some of these companies will buy back their stock even though their pension plans are not fully funded. That is an additional, not only irony, but that's an additional, I think, problem with the approach we're taking in this legislation. And the interesting thing, too, about these job losses, it's not the entry-level job. It's not somebody who's, has a pick and a shovel and they're displaced by a machine and they can go on and try to find something else. We're talking about jobs, for example, in radiology. With computers and artificial intelligence today, doctors will admit that they can read X-rays better than many of the technicians. They can do it in such a way that you don't need as many radiologists to review the records. They can be much more efficient. So we're talking now about jobs that are not poor entry-level jobs and they can just go on and do something else. We're talking about people who have master's degrees, who have years of training. And this is going to come very quickly to us. And the displacement in the workforce, again, it'll be up throughout the ranks, from the entry-level worker to the trained nurse radiologist to radiologists themselves, for one example, where they're suddenly cast out. And what do? How do they compensate? Where do they get a job? That is an issue we know is going to happen. We know it's going to happen. And we're weakening ourselves financially from being able to respond. And as a result, the legislation that's being proposed is oblivious to what we know is going to happen. And part of being here today is when people come down, and again, and they will, we need more money for national defense. Well, why don't we do that now instead of giving a big tax cut and raise the deficit? When people come down in a few years or a few months and say, this opioid crisis is out of control, it's even worse than it was when the president declared the emergency, let's do something. We don't have the money. And in a very few years, when people come down and say, we're losing hundreds of thousands of good jobs, let's do something, the answer will be, sorry, we can't. And by the way, we don't have much of a safety net for those people who are being displaced by these machines because we've eroded that too. We have huge challenges before us, and the American people are watching us. They know these things. They're seeing in their workplace machines gradually replacing human beings. If you're a driver for a UPS and you haven't figured out yet that these big companies are buying autonomous vehicles, they're using drones to deliver packages, et cetera, they get it. They understand what's coming. They see their children with huge debt living at home because they can't afford to buy a home given their debt to school loans. They sense the fragility of their not only jobs, but the support for their parents in Medicare and Medicaid aspects. One of the interesting things, which I thought was interesting when we're going on to entitlement reform, the biggest amount of money spent in Medicaid goes to nursing homes. And it goes to individuals who are not the poorest of the poor. They're people, middle-class people, seniors, or people with long-term disabilities that have exhausted most of their funds. They've sold the house, or they've mortgaged the house, et cetera. And they're the ones who are taking the bulk of the Medicaid money and funding. So if we cut Medicaid, what we're going to do is tell a lot of people, working, middle-class people, you're out. You're out of this nursing home. Or they're going to tell their sons and daughters, you thought you had a problem paying off your children's tuition. You thought you had a problem at work because you haven't got a raise in several years. Guess what? Your mother's, unless you come up with $1,000 extra a month, she's out of that nursing home. That's the reality. That's what Americans around their kitchen tables and at the coffee shops are talking about. They're not talking about big tax cuts for the wealthiest corporations and individuals. No surprise, if you look at any of the polling with respect to this tax bill, the American people are against it. My colleagues, particularly on the other side, are committed to getting something through that the American people don't want. They've said it. The polling has been extensive. We don't want this. We have real problems in the country. So I am here simply to say that I believe this is a grave mistake. And I don't think any of us going forward should be in the position of saying, someone should have told me. Someone should have told me we need trillions of dollars to improve our defense above and beyond the current money we're spending. Someone should have told me that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of jobs, good jobs, are going away because of artificial intelligence. Someone should have told me that young people are drowning under college debt and we should fix that. Someone should have told me that we are in a situation where working conditions and the prospect of work is so fragile for so many people. I think this is a grave mistake. I hope my colleagues would reflect on what we're about to do and reject it. With that, Madam President, I would yield the floor.